Okay, so I've set my facing piece back over here in my facing pile. I've already sewn it. Now you may want to do one last check to make sure that you sewed the pieces together correctly. Okay, so basically you should have your backs over here. You should have your seam lines that are touching each other, and then you should have two of the front bodice pieces. Okay, and they should fit together like that. Now no matter which order you sew them together in, as long as they look like this, you should be okay. If you don't have two pieces that are basically like a mirror image of each other, then now would be the time to go back and change it. Like, you shouldn't have two of these pieces sewn exactly this way. You should have one sewn like this. Let me look down a little bit. You should have one sewn like this, and then one sewn in the opposite direction. Okay. Does that make sense? Okay. Now you're going to put this one, the facing, back into the pile over there with your other piece of facing. And then now we're going to work back on the shell. Okay. Okay, now taking a cue from our direction card with all the information on how to sew it. Step number 4 says on the outside, pin each strap to the upper edge of bodice back, matching small circles and having raw edges even. And then it says baste it. So what we're going to do, I've taken my 2 straps here and I've placed them right on the little snips. Now if you were following along with me earlier when we were cutting this back piece out, instead of marking the circles, because the circles end up on the seam allowances, we made snips instead. And if I can move this fabric out of the way, you can see it. Yeah. Alright. So there's a snip there, right on both sides. And I've already put my straps right on top, and I've pinned each one. Now what you can do, if you want to do yours like how I'm doing it, there are 2 ends of it, because remember, to make it easier to turn, we sewed up one end and then the other end we left raw. I put the raw end on the end that's going to go in the seam allowance, because if you read ahead in the directions, this is actually going to go on the outside of the bodice, and I'll explain more on that later. But this end is not going to be tucked into a seam allowance. It's going to be stitched on top. So if you come over here, I think the raw edge would be better on the inside of a seam. Okay. And the same thing goes for that one. Now what I did, pointing towards the center, I made the seam lines go towards the inside. I hope that's not too confusing. So if you look at it, there's a seam line there, and there's not one on that side. I have both of the seams pointing towards the center front, or the center back. Okay? So you can do that, and we're going to sew on our little sewing machine here. We're going to just sew over it. When they say baste it, you really don't have to pay much attention to that part on this step, because it's not something we're really going to have to take out. You can just baste right over it. So this will be fine, or it's just stitch right over it without worrying about the word baste. So I'm going to take this, I'm going to scoot it forward a little bit. Zoom in. There should be kind of clean. Okay? And then what I'm going to do, I'm going to line the fabric up with the edge of the presser foot here. Going to let that down. I'm going to put my needle down, or wind it until my needle goes down right in the middle, in the center of that strap. So that way I'm already holding the strap down with the needle that I'm sewing with. Okay? Then I'm going to hold my back stitch button down, back stitch right to the edge, and stitch back over it, and go back and forth. Now, why did we put the fabric right on the edge here of this? That is because we don't want this stitch to show on the outside of the garment. We don't even want this stitch to be right on the seam line. We want it to be way into the seam allowance, as far as possible. So that's why we have it going close to the edge. That gives us about a 1/4 seam allowance here from this stitch line on over to the edge of the fabric. I'm going to snip all these threads. And also, just in case you don't realize, I'm using red so you can see. Okay. We're going to do the same one, or the same thing over here. And let this down. Put this needle down. Back stitch, forward stitch, back stitch, forward stitch. Lift your foot up, or lift your needle up. Lift everything up. Like a push-up. And then there. Okay, so now your straps are sewn. Now let's move on to the next step. Okay, so the next step, step number 5, was for us to stitch the bodice facing sections together at the right seam. We did that step already just a second ago, so now we can move on to step 6. So it's kind of like we skipped a step even though we didn't. So now it says pin the facing to the bodice right sides together, matching notches, centers, and seams. Stitch upper and front edges, trim seam allowances. So what we are going to do is pin both of our pieces. We're going to go grab that facing piece we just sewed together, and then take the piece that we're using now with the straps on it, and we are going to stitch them together. We're going to lay them on top of each other, right sides touching, and then we are going to sew this upper edge all the way to the end. Okay? So I'm going to grab this one. Now we're already looking at the right side here. Okay? Zoom out. So we're already looking at the right side here. That's the side that we sewed the straps onto. So I'm just going to take my facing piece and place it down right on top of that other piece with the right side touching the right side. Match all of my little notches and triangles, pin it together, and then we will sew it. Now if you feel funny about having these straps just sitting right in the middle of your seam, you can put a pin through it, and that way it may feel more secure when you're sewing over it. It will be a good idea to put pins in it anyway, just because you want the straps to come out of the seam as straight as possible instead of being kind of crooked, which might happen if you just let it do what it wants to do by itself. So I'm going to kind of space my pins out some so I don't go pin crazy. Go here. Then I'm also going to pin right on the seam allowance. I'm going to open up the seam. And I'm going to match the seam perfectly as possible. You open it up, look at it like this, make that seam flat with your finger while you're opening it. Then hold it in place. I'm going to pin it diagonally. You can also pin it the other direction diagonally, and that should help it stay in place really, really well. I kind of made an X with my pins, so that should stay open. Okay. Then just go through and just sew that whole top seam, and try to make sure that these pieces, these little flaps, stay open while you're sewing it. Okay. Okie dokie. So if you can see here, we are on to step number 7, which says understitch the facing. Oops, you can't see that. Understitch the facing as far as possible, and then it gives you a cute little confusing picture here. So what we do, we take this piece that we have now sewn together, and it's all wonderful, and you can slowly start to see the dress taking shape slowly. Oh, real quick, I want to mention, up here, even though it is square or kind of, you know, abrupt in its shape, I just rounded my shape. Oh, gracious. I just rounded my shape. You wanna know why? That is because when you're coming here and you're looking at what it's going to look like, or you're thinking about what it's going to look like when you finish it, this seam line is basically the shape that your dress is going to be. And you don't want this big square shape sitting here at the top of the bust. So a rounded shape is going to be much more appealing. So if you haven't done it already, round your shape off, okay? And then we're going to focus on this understitching thing. Now, when you look at the two sides, remember that one side is going to be, what is it? The outside, and one side is going to be the inside that we're looking at here. Okay, if you open these up. This is the outside, and then this is going to be the inside that goes up against the body. Okay, we need to push the seam allowance over towards the inside. So if you have both of these pieces here, these are, where is this camera pointing? Both of these pieces here, these are both of the back pieces. And if you push the seam allowance over to this right side, then you should be able to go down in a line really close to the edge and stitch. And that is what the understitching is. It's basically a top stitch that is done in order to help everything kind of flip in one direction. And if I can think of a better explanation, I will. Also go through and check to make sure your seams are lining up as well as you can, and just also to make sure that your stitching is good. Like here I have a big space where you can tell that the seam was not perfectly straight, and then you turn over and you look and you can see exactly what happened. Okay, so go through, make any corrections to your stitching that you need to, and then we're going to open this up. We're going to flip the seam allowance over to the right side, and then we're going to come here and we're going to understitch as close as we possibly can. Okay?